I'm going to talk a little bit about design intent and about constraints and relations within parts that you're designing. These apply to every CAD program. Sometimes they're named a little bit different things, but they work the same way. And the basic idea with design intent is that even if you change the dimensions of some of your geometry, the idea of what you were trying to convey with your design still is retained within the model. So in this first example of the part that we made in the part tutorial, we've got this square shape with a round shape in the center of it. And the way that we did that was to draw this 120 millimeter square, which we extruded, and then we created this circle, which is dimensioned from two of the perpendicular edges of the square by half of the side of each square. So that's all well and fine, unless we decide for some reason that we want to change the size of our rectangle. So say instead of making it 120 millimeters wide, we're going to make it 200 millimeters wide. Then when we build the model, our round feature that was originally in the center is shifted to one side because this feature is only controlled off of the edges rather than from something that infers that it should remain centered in this rectangular shape. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can do this. I'm going to show you a couple of quick ones. So for example, I'm going to hit E for extrude, and I'm going to start a similar thing with a rectangle. And let's dimension it to be 4 inches by 4 inches square, same as we had before. One of the interesting things that you can do with extrude and cut features is when we did our original model, we created a square, and then we created the round boss on the front of it, and then we cut the hole in it. So there's no reason why you can't have multiple closed shapes in a sketch. So I'm going to show you if I create some circle in this shape, and let's make it an inch diameter that I've just placed arbitrarily for now. Now when I create my extrusion, the software recognizes that I've got two closed shapes in here, and it's going to leave this one open. So you can simultaneously make multiple features in your part rather than doing them individually if you know, for example, you want a square thing with a hole in it. So now if I go in, I'm going to constrain this in a couple of different ways to show how design intent can help you get your idea across. So the blue features are the ones that still need something to constrain them. So right now I can grab this circle and I can drag it around in here. One way that I like to constrain parts is to use construction geometry. So right now, the rectangle that I drew and the circle are sketch entities that the software is recognizing should be used for my extrusion. So if I go into my sketch, and if you right click on this circle or bring the circle up, there's an option over here to turn it into construction geometry. And that's this button right here that goes from a solid line to a dotted line. So when I go to the dotted line, the software changes what the line looks like. And now when I extrude the part, that circle disappears. Is that geometry is only being used within the sketch as some kind of a reference so that you can build other features. So in order to easily constrain the circle to be in the middle of my box, you could do something like, really convenient thing to do is see if you mouse over one of these lines, I get this yellow midpoint lights up right here, and it's in the center of that line. And what that lets me do is that will let me draw a line from that midpoint out to some position. I can grab my circle and place it on the end of that line. And then if I swap both of these construction geometries, so my little leader line is now dashed and my circle is solid, when I create the part again, it leaves my circular feature dimensioned off the midpoint this way, but I can change other dimensions and rebuild the sketch and not move it around. So if I wanted that circle to stay in the middle of the block, I could do something like add another line on the midpoint here where they intersect, bring my circle over so it's now intersected with both of those lines that are now construction geometry. And when I close my part, now my circular hole's in the center of this part. And if I change the geometry even more, My circular hole stays constrained to the middle of the part because that's what I've done with the construction geometry. So you can do things like put the lines off of the midpoint. One thing that I like to do rather than drawing two lines like this is you can bring your rectangle up and do one line between the two corners. So if I make that construction geometry and I grab my circle and place it on the midpoint there, then whenever I move or change the dimensions of the rectangle, the circle stays in the center. So this is a really powerful way that you can quickly make designs that will maintain what you're trying to get across if you know a little bit beforehand what you're doing, if you plan out a little bit beforehand what you want to accomplish. So what if you wanted something like, if you wanted like a plate with 4 holes that always stayed the same distance from the edges or something like that? Well, that's really easy to do in a similar fashion also. I can go into my box. I'm going to offset all of the edges. I'm going to reverse it so they go inside and say I want my bolt pattern to be offset a 1/2 inch from all the edges of my box. So now when I move those, the 2 offsets stay the same distance from each other. I'm going to use my inner box as construction geometry. And I'm going to put holes for my bolts to go through at the corners. And when you first make them, you don't have to make everything the right size to start with. I like to draw things kind of arbitrarily and go in and size them later. So once they're all in here, I could go in with my dimension key and do something like say, I want this to be sized for a 1/4 inch bolt. I'm going to make it a 1/4 inch diameter. And I've still got to deal with these other 3 things. So you could go in and dimension all of them. But what if I know that I want all of them to use the same size bolt? So I can do something like select all of my circles. I can come over here to relations where I can tell the software that I want these to have something to do with each other. So I can make them do things like move them around, but what I want them to do is I want them to be the same size. So I'm going to click on the equal button here. That makes all of these the same size. So if I add a dimension to one, or if I change one, all of them change together. I'm going to redimension this one. That's going to be the same as all of those back to a 1/4 inch. Now, when I move my box around, if I decide I'm going to change the size of this plate, the holes that are in there always remain the same distance apart, regardless of how big or small you change the size of the plate. And it's really common that you'll end up like making something or 3D printing something or machining something and decide that it actually needs to be a different size. And this will let you really easily adjust your model and maintain how some of the parts go together. So I hope that was helpful. There are all kinds of different ways that you can use this construction geometry to your advantage. Other ways that we talked about already, like in the very first lab that we learned, were where we were having you make reference geometry. And you can do things like that too. You could make reference geometry between 2 sides of your plate and use that to establish if something was going to be in the center or not. Depending on what you're doing, if you're going to use that reference geometry for more than one thing, that might be a good way to do it, so that you can keep reusing it multiple times for other features, or if you're going to use it for alignment or something like that. If you're just putting features within your part, I think that using construction geometry in your sketches is usually a faster way to do it. Hopefully that's helpful.